what are ways that magic might stymie technology, might prevent its progress, or vice versa? Can you just give us some ways that that could potentially happen? We can have a chat about it maybe.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things is talking about some of the earlier examples is that if you are developing magic and magic solves all your problems, then maybe you don't need to develop technology, right? Like if you don't need to develop the wheel or the lever if you're doing these mechanical tasks through levitation or through other forms. And then of course the question is, well, what happens when that starts to run out, right? So like if you start running out of crude oil, what do you do when your entire society is built on you know, the fossil fuels and things like that? It's the same question. What if your world is entirely built on magic? It's going to get really bad for a lot of people if you no longer know or never develop the technologies that make life like we know it today, sort of what we think of as commonplace. If that goes away, like, wow, how do you change gears there? And especially if you're looking at medieval worlds, who's educated, who who even knows whether these supplies are strong or low or whatever they are. So I think that those are some things too, in which just thinking about how, I mean, one of the problems too with like major paradigm shifts is now in the 21st century, we are the beneficiaries of all of this, you know, millennia of knowledge. But it's like, okay, well, you go back before, you know, we start getting into some of the technologies of the Middle Ages or even Renaissance and later. It's like, well, people didn't think about things in the same way. It's like you didn't think about having massive cotton fields or things like that because that's not what anybody needed. They weren't trying to take care of a population that was that big. So it would never have even occurred to them. So thinking too about, you can't go back in the Middle Ages and think about people, you know, building spaceships or cars or something like that, because it's like they don't have, that wouldn't be within their mindset yet. Unless, of course, it is, right? Unless, of course, there's something else that's been happening that you're like, well, what if I do have a motorized cart that doesn't need horses? You know what I mean? Those kinds of questions. But I think we overestimate in this time of exponential technological change and technological innovation. There are centuries in the Middle Ages in which nothing got made. You know, nothing new came on the scene that changed things. And you start thinking about centuries and generations, right? Well, that's generations of people who had no major technological disruption in their entire lives, right? But then you get towards the early 20th century and it's like, okay, well, we went from planes to being on the moon in about 70 years, which is mind-blowing. Like that's the most rapid expansion. And then you get the internet and everything that comes after it in the second half of the 20th century. This is not the way that most of the world has worked, right? There's not that level of technological change happening at that rate. And then also the impact that it makes worldwide. We're living in a time in which things change overnight and things change very, very fast. But in other kinds of worlds, unless there are rationales for why things would be distributed that fast and that wide around the world, it could be very local, right? And spread. And you think about information and technologies that spread down the Silk Road, you know, from between Europe and Asia. It's slow going, right? And certain people, certain populations are beneficiaries of those technologies first, and then other people learn about it. And they're like, hey, where can I get some, of that, right? I can't remember what your original question is, but maybe it answered it.
Some ways that magic can stymie technology or vice versa.
Right.
No, I mean, you've raised some very interesting projects, some very interesting points, sorry, that's what I was trying to say. Yeah. And particularly things like, as you mentioned, for example, the Arabic Golden Age. A lot of the stuff that they were producing and a lot of the research that was being done would have seemed like magic to
absolutely.
England, for example, in the same period, because England was going through what is affectionately known as the Dark Ages, where we were living in trees and eating rocks. And the Arab world was going through an incredible golden age enlightenment period. So when you don't have news traveling, and that could be because people are being secretive and do not want to release that knowledge. That's another way that magic or technology could be stymied, is that people don't want to share, and we'll be talking more about that after the break. Then you can absolutely see one or other of these not progressing. There's a great example. I told this to Trent earlier. In China, they invented porcelain, which was an amazing substance. Europe kept trying to make it and failing. Now, they used it for cups and plates and all sorts of different aspects of their world. They used it for everything in China. It was an incredibly ubiquitous substance. And so, this is a somewhat teleological argument, they never invented glass. Now, glass is one of the things that really furthered technology within Europe. With glass, you could make non-reactive test tubes, so it furthered chemistry. With glass, you could make lenses, so it furthered things like microscopic studies, and it furthered, actually, it lengthened the careers of academics. So academics had another 10 to 20 useful years of study, which meant that they were studying more and then passing more on to the next generation. So glass had this massive impact in Europe, and it was never developed in China because they had porcelain, and porcelain just worked. They didn't need something else. And that is a great example of how one technology can prevent another one from being invented or introduced.
Yep.
And in my opinion, magic and technology can work in the same way, because they fill the same kind of niche, the same kind of facet of, as I've said, getting stuff done. If you can do it with magic, why would you bother tinkering around with stuff? It's only when there's a dearth. It's only when there's a reason. If it's expensive, if it's restricted only to a few people, if it becomes taboo for some reason, or whatever else it could be, that's the reason that you would then start fiddling around with technology, because otherwise it's very much path of least resistance.
Yeah, and I think a couple other examples as you were talking, I was saying too before we came on air that I've been listening to these the great courses, history lectures, and they're just fascinating all throughout the Middle Ages. Another sort of example along those same lines, and I think you could just swap out one technology for a magical substance or a magical process and get to the same place, is that China had created paper long before Europe did. But because of the nature of their writing, right, they're writing characters, and there's thousands upon thousands of different characters. In Europe, they have letters, right? So you only got 26 letters. So that's why China didn't come up with the printing press, because it was impossible to come up with thousands and thousands of characters in a printing press, where it was relatively easy. I mean, it's one of those things that it seems easy in hindsight. But yeah, you just, instead of having everybody handwrite everything, you got little metal letters, you set it, and then you run off, 100,000 of those. Yeah. Gunpowder is, of course, the other really obvious one, is where they've got, you've got a noble who's got his castle and isn't paying his taxes, and it's really hard to get him out, right? So you got to lay siege, and you got to wait, but then you get gunpowder, and it's like, we'll just roll that cannon up, and we're going to blast ourselves a back door. This is not going to be a problem, right? So and the same thing with knights as well. Like, you start shooting gunpowder in terms of personal firearms comes around quite a bit later than all sorts of different kinds of cannonballs and things like that. And it's like, your suit of armor is pretty good against, someone with a pokey weapon, but then all of a sudden, when you can take a cannonball that cuts take somebody's head clear off, you got to start thinking about different strategies. And I think that you could easily swap in innovations in either technology or magic going either way, to just say, well, the way that we've been doing things for a century or so needs to change, because now there's this new player on the scene, and it reconfigures everything. And that's where, too, again, thinking about the political structures, the economic structures, the social structures, how does it shift? Does that give an unexpected advantage to any of them, right? I mean, it doesn't always need to be the people on top. It could be the people who are the sort of the underclasses. But again, it's one of those things that it's a lot of fun. I was talking with somebody, one of the editors at Worldbuilding magazine, doing an interview that'll be out, actually, it should be coming out anytime soon, in the next couple of days. But those very kinds of questions of, instead of trying to decide all of the stuff for your world, add a little random, flip a coin, say which is going to win, the magic or the technology. And instead of you deciding, roll a die, flip a card, flip a coin, right? And it's like, oh, well, now this wins. So then instead of trying to come up with it all by yourself, you can start thinking around, well, the fates gave me the answer. It was magic that won. And now I'm going to have to think about all the reasons why, and it gets your head in a different space rather than having that pressure of trying to rationalize everything. You just have to sort of explain, you know what I mean? Have somebody else, the fates, make the decisions, and then you can explain and make those connections yourself. That can make
right, and rationalize it post facto. Yeah, absolutely.